Have you ever wondered what love really looks like? When everything gets hard. Not the kind of love in big moments or perfect days, but the quiet kind. The kind that shows up every single morning. The kind that stays awake at night just to make sure someone else is okay. For over 9 months, James didn't just say he loved Deep. He proved it in the smallest ways. From learning how to cook when he had no idea where to start, to staying by her side through every moment of exhaustion, every wave of pain, every sleepless night. And when the day finally came, the moment that would change their lives forever, he realized that everything he had done was leading to one single moment. The moment he became a father. This is not just a story about pregnancy. It's a story about love, responsibility, and what it truly means to stand by someone when they need you the most. And trust me, the ending is something you don't want to miss. So before we begin, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because stories like this, they stay with you long after the video ends. James didn't realize how much those 9 months would change him until he was already deep inside them. At the beginning, everything felt new, almost unreal. The moment they found out Diep was pregnant, James stood there frozen, staring at the test in her hand as if it might suddenly change. But when it didn't, when it stayed there, clear and undeniable, something shifted inside him. Not panic, not fear, just a quiet, overwhelming sense of responsibility. And from that moment on, he didn't let go of it. The early days were the hardest. Diep's body changed faster than either of them expected. She was constantly tired. Her appetite disappeared, and some mornings she couldn't even get out of bed without feeling dizzy. James noticed everything. The way she held her stomach without realizing it. The way she forced a smile even when she clearly didn't feel okay. He didn't say much about it. He just acted. Every morning, he woke up before her, quietly, carefully, so he wouldn't disturb her sleep. He would go into the kitchen and try to prepare something simple. Porridge, soup, sometimes just warm milk. At first, he had no idea what he was doing. He burned things. He made food that didn't taste right. But he kept trying, because every time Diep managed to eat even a few spoonfuls, it felt like a small victory. Just a little more, he would say gently, sitting beside her. Diep would shake her head weakly, but sometimes, because it was him, she tried again. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. James became more attentive, more patient. He learned how to adjust the food. Less oil, softer textures, lighter flavors. He noticed which smells made her uncomfortable and avoided them completely. He started keeping track of what she could eat on good days and what she absolutely couldn't tolerate on bad ones. He didn't complain, not once. At night, even when he was exhausted, he stayed awake longer than he needed to, just watching her sleep, making sure her breathing was steady, making sure she wasn't uncomfortable. Sometimes, Diep would wake up in the middle of the night, shifting slightly, unable to find a comfortable position. Before she could even say anything, James would already be there. "Do you need water? Are you okay? Wait, let me fix the pillow." His voice was always soft, careful, like he was afraid of making things worse if he spoke too loudly. And slowly, without realizing it, taking care of her became the center of his world. By the time Diep entered her later months, things became heavier, not just physically, but emotionally too. Her movements slowed down. Simple tasks, like standing up or walking across the room, took more effort. Some days, she felt frustrated with herself. She hated feeling dependent. "I can do it," she would insist, quietly, trying to get up on her own. But James was always there, steady and calm. "I know you can," he would say, offering his hand anyway. "But let me help you." There was no pressure in his voice, no pity, just support. And Diep, she stopped resisting after a while, not because she couldn't do things, but because she knew she didn't have to do everything alone anymore. That realization made things lighter for her. Around the 8th month, James started becoming even more careful, almost overly careful. He double-checked everything: the hospital bag, the documents, the phone numbers. He even practiced the route to the hospital multiple times, driving back and forth just to make sure he wouldn't get lost or delayed when the time came. Diep noticed it one evening when he came back slightly out of breath. "Where did you go?" she asked. James hesitated for a second before answering honestly. "I just wanted to make sure I know the fastest way to the hospital." Diep looked at him, her eyes softening. "You're worrying too much," she said gently. James shook his head slightly. "I just don't want anything to go wrong." That was the truth, simple and direct. As the days got closer, the air in the house felt different, quieter, heavier, like both of them were waiting for something they couldn't fully predict. And then one morning, it happened. It started subtly. Diep woke up earlier than usual, shifting uncomfortably. At first, she thought it was just another wave of discomfort she had grown used to over the past months. But this time, it didn't fade. Instead, it came back stronger. She sat up slowly, placing her hand on her stomach, breathing carefully. "James," she called softly. He was already awake. Within seconds, he was beside her. "What's wrong?" His voice immediately filled with concern. Diep hesitated, trying to read her own body. "I think it's starting." For a brief moment, everything went silent. James froze, not because he didn't understand, but because he understood too clearly. "It's time." The words echoed in his head. His heart started racing, but his body moved faster than his thoughts. Okay, he said quickly, standing up. "We're going now." His hands moved automatically, grabbing the bag he had prepared weeks ago, checking his phone, his keys. But despite all the preparation, his movements were slightly rushed, slightly unsteady. Diep tried to stand up, but another wave of pain hit her. James immediately rushed back to her side. "Slowly," he said, supporting her carefully. "I'm here." His voice was steady again, firm, grounded. He helped her walk, one step at a time, guiding her out of the house. Before they could leave, another figure appeared at the door, his mother. She had already sensed something was different that morning. "Is it time?" she asked quickly. James nodded. "Yes." Without hesitation, she stepped forward to help. "Let's go. Don't waste time." The three of them moved together, quickly but carefully. James supported Diep on one side, his mother on the other. Every step mattered. When they reached the car, James opened the door gently, helping Diep sit down as comfortably as possible. "I'm right here," he said again, his voice softer now. Diep looked at him, her face pale but calm. "I know." That small exchange, it steadied him more than anything else. James got into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel tightly for a second before starting the engine. This was the moment he had been preparing for, and yet nothing could truly prepare him for how it felt. As the car moved forward, the world outside seemed distant. The roads, the buildings, the people, they all blurred into the background. All that mattered was the quiet breathing beside him, and the fact that everything was about to change. The drive to the hospital felt both too fast and unbearably slow at the same time. James kept his eyes fixed on the road, hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than he realized. Every red light felt like an obstacle. Every second stretched longer than it should. He had driven this route so many times before, memorizing every turn, every shortcut. But now, with Diep in the back seat, breathing through the pain, everything felt different. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice controlled but tense. From the back, Diep nodded slightly, one hand gripping the seat, the other resting on her stomach. "I'm okay. Just keep going," she said, her voice soft but strained. James's mother sat beside her, gently supporting her shoulders. "Breathe slowly," she said calmly. "Don't rush it. We're almost there." Her voice carried a kind of steadiness that filled the car, balancing out the urgency that James couldn't hide. When they finally arrived at the hospital, James didn't even wait for the engine to fully stop before stepping out. He rushed to open the back door, carefully helping Diep out of the car. "I've got you," he said, one arm firmly supporting her. Everything after that moved quickly. Nurses approached, guiding them inside. The bright lights, the clean smell of the hospital, the distant sounds of footsteps and voices, it all created a space that felt both safe and overwhelming at the same time. James stayed close, never letting go of Diep's hand, even when they reached the delivery room doors. "Sir, you'll have to wait outside for now," one of the nurses said gently. For a second, James didn't react. He looked at Diep. She looked back at him, her eyes tired but steady. "It's okay," she whispered. "I'll be fine." James swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "I'll be right here," he said, squeezing her hand one last time before letting go. And just like that, the doors closed. The silence that followed was heavy. James stood there for a moment, staring at the door as if he could see through it, as if staying close enough would somehow make things easier for her. But he couldn't go in, so he waited. He paced back and forth, unable to sit still. His thoughts raced uncontrollably. Every possible outcome, every fear he had tried to push away over the past months suddenly came rushing back. What if something goes wrong? What if she's in too much pain? What if I should be doing more? Each question hit him harder than the last. His mother watched him quietly from a nearby chair. "Sit down," she said gently. James shook his head. "I can't." She didn't force him. She just nodded, understanding that this was something he had to go through in his own way. Time passed, but it didn't feel like time. Minutes stretched into something much longer. The hallway remained the same, unchanged, while everything inside that room was happening without him. At one point, James stopped pacing and leaned against the wall, closing his eyes for a brief moment. He thought about the past 9 months. Every morning he woke up early to make sure Diep could eat something. Every night he stayed up, watching over her. Every small moment, helping her walk, adjusting her pillows, learning how to cook properly, driving her to checkups. All of it led to this. And for the first time, he realized something clearly. He had done everything he could. Now, all he could do was trust. Suddenly, a sound broke through the silence. A cry. Sharp, clear, alive. James's eyes snapped open. For a moment, he didn't move. Then slowly, the realization hit him. The baby. His baby. Without thinking, he stepped closer to the door, his heart pounding harder than ever before. Seconds later, the door opened. A nurse stepped out, her expression calm but warm. "Congratulations," she said with a small smile. "It's a boy." The words landed softly, but their impact was overwhelming. James blinked, as if he needed a second to fully process what he just heard. "A boy?" he repeated quietly. The nurse nodded. "Yes, both mother and baby are safe." That was the moment everything inside him finally released. The tension, the fear, the weight he had been carrying for months. All of it disappeared in an instant. James let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "Thank you," he said, his voice slightly unsteady. He didn't know who he was thanking, the nurse, the moment, or something beyond that. But it didn't matter. He just needed to say it. A few minutes later, he was allowed inside. The room felt quieter now, softer, and in the center of it all, Diep. She lay there, exhausted but peaceful, her hair slightly damp, her face pale but calm in a way James had never seen before. In her arms, a tiny baby, wrapped carefully, eyes closed, breathing softly. James stopped a few steps away. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't speak. He just looked, as if afraid that if he moved too quickly, the moment would disappear. Diep noticed him and smiled faintly. "Come here," she whispered. James walked slowly toward her, each step careful, almost hesitant. When he reached the bed, he looked down at the baby, his son. So small, so fragile, and yet so real. James's eyes softened in a way that words couldn't fully describe. "Can I?" he asked quietly. Diep nodded. "Of course." Carefully, almost nervously, James reached out. The moment the baby was placed in his arms, everything else faded. The world became quiet. Still, he looked down, his hands supporting something so delicate, so important. His son shifted slightly, letting out a soft sound, and James smiled. Not the kind of smile he used before, not light, not casual. This one was deeper, quieter, filled with something stronger than happiness. "I'm here," he whispered. It wasn't just for the baby. It was for both of them. For Diep. For this new life they had created together. For everything that was about to begin. Diep watched him, her eyes filled with warmth. "You did well," she said softly. James shook his head slightly. "We did." That was the truth. They didn't need anything else in that moment. No words, no explanations. Just the three of them, in that quiet hospital room, holding on to something that felt like the beginning of everything. Outside, life continued as usual. But inside that room, A new family had just begun.